The office was quiet that Friday afternoon, the usual hum of activity reduced to a faint murmur as people began wrapping up for the weekend. Only a few of us were left finishing up reports, the distant sounds of keyboards clicking and paper shuffling echoing through the open floor. I had stayed back to finalize a presentation due on Monday, a project that had taken weeks of late nights and endless drafts. I thought I was alone until I noticed Mr. Carter's office light was still on. He had come in earlier in the day, barely sparing a glance as he walked past my desk. Mr. Carter had always been composed, efficient, a man of few words but with an intense focus that left little room for casual conversation. At first, I had felt intimidated working under him, his quiet authority a constant reminder of his position, but over time, that intimidation softened into something else, an unspoken understanding, an odd sense of comfort that I couldn't quite place. As I sat there, flipping through my notes, his voice broke through the silence. "Rachel, are you still here?" I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his gaze steady, though his expression was unreadable. There was something about the way he looked at me in that moment, a flicker of warmth beneath his usual detached demeanor, that made my pulse quicken. "Yes, just finishing up the slides for Monday's presentation," I replied, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. He nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke again. "I know you've put a lot of effort into this project. I wanted to go over it with you if you have the time." I swallowed, nodding, feeling a strange thrill at the idea of working alone with him, though I told myself it was purely professional. "Of course. I'll bring my notes to the conference room." A few minutes later, I entered the dimly lit conference room, my laptop tucked under one arm, heart racing as I took a seat across from him. The room felt different, quieter, as if the walls held our silence in anticipation. Mr. Carter sat with a kind of effortless composure, his sleeves rolled up, his gaze focused as he motioned for me to begin. I started the presentation, clicking through the slides and explaining my process, though I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on me, his focus more intense than usual. I tried to ignore it, concentrating on the task at hand, but every time I looked up, I found his gaze waiting, steady and unwavering, a subtle tension simmering in the space between us. As I finished, he leaned back, his hand resting on the edge of the table, his fingers tapping thoughtfully. "Impressive work, Rachel," he said softly, his voice holding an edge of warmth. "You've really gone above and beyond." "Thank you," I replied, feeling my cheeks warm under his praise. I looked away, trying to hide the flush creeping up my face, but I could feel his gaze on me, unwavering, as if he could see right through the carefully crafted professionalism I wore. There was a brief silence, one that stretched just a little too long, and I felt my heart begin to race, an unspoken energy filling the room, making the air feel thicker, heavier. "You've been working late a lot these past few weeks," he murmured, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "I hope it hasn't been too much." "No, it's been fine," I replied, though the truth was that the late nights had taken their toll. I hesitated, unsure why I felt the urge to be honest, but I continued anyway. "It's just, I wanted to make sure everything was perfect." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You always do." His words hung in the air, carrying a weight that felt oddly personal. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a strange thrill at the subtle warmth in his gaze, the hint of something that felt far too intimate for a simple meeting. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," I managed, my voice barely a whisper, suddenly aware of how close we were, how his hand rested just inches from mine on the table. The silence between us grew heavier, charged with something unspoken, a tension that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge, yet couldn't ignore. "James," he corrected softly, his gaze still locked on mine. "You can call me James." I hesitated, the familiarity of his first name feeling foreign on my tongue, but I nodded. "James." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a slight softening, and he leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Rachel, I don't usually do this," he began, his voice barely above a murmur, as if he were confessing something he had held back for far too long. "Do what?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat as the space between us seemed to shrink, his hand moving just a fraction closer to mine, his gaze intense, filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. He hesitated, his fingers brushing mine in a barely there touch, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me, a thrill that left me breathless, frozen in place. His hand lingered, his touch tentative, as if testing the waters, waiting for some unspoken permission. In that moment, I knew we were crossing a line, one that couldn't be erased, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning in, my hand meeting his, fingers entwining in a silent acknowledgement of the connection we both felt yet hadn't dared to voice. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of longing and restraint, and I felt my heart race, the air thick with the weight of unspoken desires, emotions we had both hidden beneath layers of professionalism. "James," I murmured, barely able to speak, my mind clouded with the intensity of the moment, with the realization that we were standing on the edge of something irrevocable. He took a deep breath, his gaze searching mine, and I saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between duty and desire, between restraint and the pull we both felt. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he leaned in, his face inches from mine, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle, yet filled with an intensity that left me breathless. I felt myself leaning into his touch, my eyes closing as his fingers lingered on my cheek, a soft, tender gesture that felt far more intimate than any words we could have shared. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, our lips met, a gentle brush at first, hesitant, testing, before deepening, the kiss filled with a need, a hunger that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. His hand slipped to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into the embrace, every thought, every worry slipping away, leaving only the warmth of his touch, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the undeniable connection that bound us together in that moment. The kiss grew deeper, more urgent, and I felt my hands move to his shoulders, clutching him as if he were the only thing anchoring me, grounding me in a world that had suddenly narrowed to just the two of us. The taste of him, the warmth of his breath, the way his hands moved over me. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, a release of everything we had held back, every unspoken feeling finally laid bare. We pulled back slightly, both of us breathless, our foreheads resting together, and I felt a wave of emotions crash over me, a mixture of exhilaration and fear, of longing and the realization that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. We stayed like that for a moment, our breathing mingling in the quiet stillness of the room, both of us absorbing the weight of what had just happened. His hands remained on my shoulders, grounding me, and I could feel his heart racing as fast as mine. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze, and saw a flicker of hesitation, a shadow of worry that mirrored my own. But beneath that, there was also a tenderness, a depth of feeling that made my heart ache. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice soft, hesitant, as if he were still trying to understand the moment. I didn't mean for this to happen." I shook my head, my fingers tracing the fabric of his shirt, my touch lingering as I struggled to find the words. "Neither did I admitted, feeling the truth of it settle over me. But even as I said it, I knew I didn't regret it. There was a kind of raw honesty in that embrace, a vulnerability we had both shared, and I wasn't ready to let go. He looked down, his gaze flickering to our intertwined hands, a small, almost rueful smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You know, I've always respected you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Admired you?" The words were simple, but they held a weight that left me breathless. I could feel the honesty in them, the quiet sincerity, and I felt my heart swell with an emotion I hadn't expected. I squeezed his hand, my thumb brushing over his knuckles in a silent acknowledgement of everything we couldn't say. "James," I began, my voice trembling slightly, but before I could finish, he reached up, his fingers grazing my cheek, silencing me with a touch that was both gentle and unyielding. There was something in his gaze, a mixture of vulnerability and determination, that left me feeling exposed, my own feelings laid bare. "I don't know where this leaves us," he whispered, his eyes searching mine, and I felt a pang of uncertainty, a reminder of the world outside this quiet moment. But I also felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that whatever happened next, this moment was ours, something that couldn't be taken away. I leaned into his touch, my eyes closing as I let myself savor the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his presence. There was a safety in his touch, a comfort that made me feel seen, understood in a way that went beyond words. As the reality of the world outside began to seep back in, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, longing, fear, gratitude, and a sense of loss for the simplicity we had left behind. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze one last time, and in that moment, I saw a reflection of my own turmoil, the unspoken acknowledgement that this connection, this moment, would remain with us, a memory that would linger long after we returned to our separate lives. He pulled back slowly, his hand slipping from mine, but the warmth of his touch, the memory of his embrace, lingered. We sat there in silence, the weight of our shared emotions settling over us like a gentle, unyielding truth. There were no words, no explanations or apologies, only the quiet understanding that we had crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed, and that, despite everything, neither of us regretted it. As he stood up, adjusting his shirt with a slightly unsteady hand, he looked back at me, his gaze lingering, a final, silent goodbye that carried 1,000 unspoken words. And then, with a soft, almost bittersweet smile, he turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving me alone with the quiet echoes of our shared moment, the memory of his touch, and the quiet, lingering ache of something that had changed between us forever. I sat there for a long time, letting the silence settle around me, the weight of what had happened pressing down like a gentle, unyielding truth. I knew that whatever happened next, this moment would remain with me, a memory etched into the fabric of my being, a quiet reminder of a line crossed, a connection felt, and a truth that, however brief, had changed me in a way I couldn't explain. And as I finally gathered my things and left the conference room, I knew that, despite the uncertainty, despite the questions that remained unanswered, I was grateful for the moment we had shared, for the quiet honesty of his touch, and for the knowledge that sometimes, even in the most unexpected places, we find pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing.